Okay, so I think we're ready to start now. So good evening, everyone. And we'd like to start today's session with the welcome address by Mr. B.N. Verma. So Mr. Verma, please take it away for us.
Okay. Good evening and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are based. And welcome to the release of Rupert, Snell, and Neha Tiwari's magnificent rendering of the Rāmcaritmānas, a delight in every sense of the word. It is a gem of a book, and I am sure that even those who are intimately familiar with it, like many of us in North India are, will enjoy delving into it. I have been following Rupert Snell's academic career and his commitment and contributions to the Indian languages since 2011. I had made several trips to Texas at Austin to meet him and try and coax a manuscript out of him, but didn't have much luck. Then suddenly one fine morning, in my mailbox, I saw a line from him stating, "I do have a book project that might sit well with your truly inspirational list." That was on 1st October 2018. And that's how I latched on to the reading of Rāmcaritmānas. I found the manuscript fascinating. It has been written with those readers in mind who were familiar with the most widely known North Indian text of the last half millennium, and yet not close enough to it to call it their own. Such readers would savor the Awadhi version more once they knew the English equivalent of it. What attracted me to this proposal was the fluent poetic translation of Tulsi's dohas. I had never ever come across such a wonderful, easy-flowing translation, dohas into verse. In one word, mellifluous. And thanks to Rupert, I discovered layers upon layers of hidden meanings to the text because of Rupert's pakad over the Awadhi language. Pardon my delving into a second language, please. कितनी बारीकी से उन्होंने मानस को देखा और समझा है becomes evident when you read Rupert's book. और बात यही नहीं रुकती. उनके अनुवाद में आपको इश्क हकीकी और इश्क मिजाजी की खुशबू भी मिलेगी. We have been working on this book for a few years, and now that the book has manifested itself, I feel very much like Tulsi did, describing the birth of Sri Ram. Bhai prakata kripala, deen dayala, kaushalya hitakari, harshit matahari, muni manhari, adbhut roop nikhari. So it is adbhut, extraordinary, muni manhari. If it will win over all sages, wise men, and of course women, and fills me with delight, makes me harshit. I have been asked to briefly introduce all our panelists, and brief I will try and be, with due apologies to all, because Philip Lutgendorf has to leave within the next hour. Harish Trivedi, former professor of English at the University of Delhi, has been visiting professor at the universities of Chicago and London. ये जनाब अपने लेक्चर के लिए मशहूर थे. कॉलेज में इनका पहला लेक्चर सुनकर स्टूडेंट्स बोल उठे, क्या धासु लेक्चर था. Harish is the author of Colonial Transactions, English Literature and India, and has co-edited Kipling in India, India in Kipling, Literature and Nation, Britain and India, 1800 to 1990, and Post-Colonial Translation, Theory and Practice. Harish की तो बात ही कुछ और है. He translates both ways, between Hindi and English, and has edited a book in Hindi on the medieval poet Rahim. He has authored a history of South Asian literature for Literature, a World History. A feshrift for Harish Trivedi was published under the title India and the World, edited by Ruth Vanita, with contributions by many eminent scholars from around the globe. Neha Tiwari, co-author with Rupert of this book we are releasing today, is currently pursuing a master's in South Asian languages and literature from Ghent University, Belgium. Formerly a director at the Zaban School for Languages, New Delhi, she knows Hindi, Urdu, Awadhi, Sanskrit, and Persian. Wow. And is interested in the fields of language learning, pedagogy, and literature. Rupert Snell is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Asian Studies, University of Texas at Austin, and has previously taught at SOAS, University of London. He is the author of several books on Indian literature, including The Hindi Classical Tradition, a Braj Bhasha Reader, and Poems from the Satsai. Philip Lutgendorf fell in love with India while still in school, learned Hindi, then Awadhi, and has written many amazing books on Indian life and times. His book on the performance of the Hindi Ramayana, The Life of a Text, won the Kumaraswamy Prize of the Association for Asian Studies. He has a book on the cultural history of tea drinking in India and has translated the Rāmcaritmānas of Tulsidas in 7 dual language volumes for the many classical library. Hats off to you, Philip. He also ran for many years a website devoted to Bollywood, which was very popular. He served as the president of the American Institute of Indian Studies from 2010 to 2018 and continues to serve as the chair of its board of trustees. Philip retired in 2018 after having taught Hindi and modern Indian studies in the University of Iowa's Department of Asian and Slavic Languages and Literature. Ruth Vanita is poet, translator, academic, and activist all rolled into one. Her many books include Love Rights, Same-Sex Marriages in India, and Gender, Sex and City, Urdu Rekhti Poetry 1780 to 1870. She has translated several works of fiction and poetry from Hindi into English, most recently Mahadevi Verma's My Family, Mera Parivar. Her first novel, Memory of Light, appeared in 2020, and her second novel will be out next year. Her more recent books are The Dharma of Justice in Sanskrit epics, debates on gender, varna, and species, and The Broken Rainbow, Poems and Translations, and a book on Shakespeare, which will appear from Primus. Currently, she is professor and co-director of South and Southeast Asian Studies at Montana University. John Stratton Hawley, Jack to all of us, is Claire Tao Professor of Religion at Barnard College, Columbia. He has many books on India's Bhakti traditions, including A Storm of Songs, India and the Idea of Bhakti Movement, Sur's Ocean with Kenneth Bryant, and a poem by poem and commentary called Into Sur's Ocean, and the second one, Surdas, Poet, Singer, Son, published by Primus. Jack has been deeply fascinated by Vrindavan, makes regular visits to it, and greets all locals with Radhe Radhe. His book on modern-day Vrindavan has been released about a week ago in Hindi translation. Most importantly, he says that he is a great bhakt of Rupert Snell and has been so for many years. I can't help but acknowledge the fact, and this is my personal contribution. I can't help but acknowledge the fact that Jack is a wizard with words. His epistolary skills are a treat to read. They bring a smile to your face no matter what mood you are in. And Holi is round the corner, and I invite everyone to join us in this festival of color. खास तौर से मैं आमंत्रित करता हूं हरीश और फिलिप को कि हमारे साथ आके जुड़े और हमारे साथ हमको एक मौका दें उनकी किताब पब्लिश करने के लिए. And before I close, I would like to add that I would have been even more delighted if Dr. Dhanesh Jain, the founder of Primus, had been part of this celebration. For it is he who inspired me to go scouting for such manuscripts as this. For Dr. Jain, as much as it is for me, reading the Rāmcaritmānas is a wish fulfilled. So thank you all for allowing me this space. And with this, I hand over the floor to Jyotika to take forward this program. Thank you, Jyotika. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, sir, for your insightful insight on the book and for your relationship with everybody. And now, without further ado, I invite Professor Harish Trivedi to release the volume we're all here to celebrate today and show it to the audience and then to say a few words.
Rupert, do you recognize this? Not yet. This morning somebody came from Primus to tutor me on how to launch it, which ribbon to pull. I hope it works. There is a Granthi here, and below the Granthi is the Granth. So let's see. Oh, I've done it. Yeah.
Good.
And he also assured me that there is no tape, read or otherwise. Here is the book.
Good.
I was asked to release the book. I don't like the word release. A friend of mine, a publisher friend of mine, whom Bhola also knew very well, Sujit Mukherjee, the publisher, he used to say, some books are released, some others escape. So this is properly released after serving its sentence with Bhola. Launch is the word which is perhaps better suited, but the best of all is Lokarpan, which is the word in Hindi. Bhola has already set the scene by saying good evening to some and good morning to some others, and in between perhaps to those who are not mentioned. Tulsi himself has the best formula for encompassing the whole world, regardless of time zone. Siya Ramamaya Sabajaga Yani Karau Pranama Jori Jugupani. The whole world I bow to. I bow not to Sita and Ram directly by themselves, but Sita and Ram as they are manifested in the whole world amongst all the living creatures born in 84 lakh yonis or species. One can't be more comprehensive in one's greetings. Rupert, early in the book, in the introduction, tells us how to read these two lines. Not in terms of their meaning, but just the sound, the Nad Saundarya, the Chand, the Matra, the Yati, and already it's a masterclass. I also wish to, now that we have seen the book, I wish to say a word about Primus. Right from the beginning of Primus, and I've known earlier editions or earlier avatars of it, as Ratna Sagar and so on, right from the beginning of Primus, they've been producing books which are a joy to hold, not only to read, but a joy to look at, to hold and to behold. There was a time when Indian books looked like Indian books, they smelt like Indian books, and they fell apart like Indian books. We always envied just the production qualities of foreign books. Primus have shown us how to make it in India. Not only this book, but another book that I admired the production values of very much indeed recently, Devrani Jethani Ki Kahani, brilliantly produced, both these books. About the book itself, not only in my opinion, Rāmcaritmānas is the greatest book ever written in the whole of Hindi literature. But as distinct from other classics in other languages, which remain largely unread, that's the fate of classics. This book is extremely widely read and heard and sung and known by heart, kanthasth, and recited, even by people who do not know, have not known how to read, even the illiterates. That's the greatest, this no classic in the world, no great book in the world could have had as wide a readership and listenership as this book. It's a phenomenon. And another thing about this book is, it is, of course, a scripture. It's been read like scripture. My mother used to read it like scripture. I used to listen to her reading it, and at about age 7 or 8, I also began to read it initially with her, and then by myself. But I'm very sorry to report that by about age 9, I gave up the practice. I did not take to it. My mother, of course, because she read it all her life, every day, she knew a very large part of it by heart. She could locate any chaupai, any doha almost instantly in its context. She was not the only one. There are numerous people, even now in India, for whom the book means this. But it's not only scripture. It also contains a lot of secular wisdom. It also contains what Rupert has called in his wonderful introduction, humor and also wit, qualities that we don't associate with Tulsidas, not very often, because the sacred and the secular meet in this book in a way that not many other books can match. The secular wisdom of, there are quotations from this book that have been on the lips of illiterate people all over North India for centuries. The one most quoted, because it sounds fatalist, but it is actually the peak of devotion, is Hoi Hai Soi Jo Rama Rachi Rakha, Ko Kari Taraka Balhava Hi Sakha. But look at the worldly wisdom of Sur Nar Muni Sabke Yah Riti, Swarath Lagi Karai Sab Priti. Not only human beings want to be fond of people from whom they can get something, Swarath, but also Sura Nar Muni. Sura and Muni also follow the same rules. This would sound cynical if it were not humorous, if it were not witty. So these two parts, the piety and the poetry, these are equally the reasons for its very wide appeal, and in this translation, and even more in the commentary, Rupert does full justice to both these parts. I would say Rupert is devoted. Rupert is a devotee, not of Rama, I don't care, nor am I actually, but of Rāmcaritmānas. He has done this work with tremendous devotion, and that is obvious to see. The progress of the Rama story, and there are not only 300 Ramayanas, that's its gross underestimate. Ramayana Shatakoti Apara. There are 100 crore Ramayanas. the progress of the Rama story from Sanskrit up to 2023, very briefly, is Valmiki in Sanskrit 3,000 years ago, even if we date it as late as 800 BC, is 3,000. Then, of course, Tulsidas and other poets like Kamb before him, like the Kakawin Ramayana in Indonesia, even before Kamb, and in all the other Indian languages, rendering it into the vernacular, so-called. And then, early in the 20th century, or perhaps late in the 19th, there was an extremely popular Rama story in northern India, in the Hindi area, the Radheshyam Ramayana. Why was that needed? Because people did not understand Awadhi, not readily. The Radheshyam Ramayana was as popular as anything, using meters of the Parsi theatre, for example. So from Sanskrit to Awadhi to Khariboli, and now to English. This is a necessity of the times. There are any number of people in India, to say nothing of those abroad, who are most comfortable reading in the English language. And this is the ideal book for them, the ideal introduction to the greatest work that we have in North India, in Hindi, because Rupert's procedure here is not only to translate, and Philip told me when we were launching the book, just before we launched his translation, one of the earlier volumes of his translation at the Jaipur Literary Festival, he and I and Ashok Vajpayee, he told me just before that his was the 10th full translation of the Rāmcaritmānas into English. I had no idea. So even in English, there will soon be 300 Ramayanas of the translations of all these versions. And what Rupert has done is offer selections from each kant, one kant, short kant in full, and selections of various passages, which is the ideal introduction. And the greatest strength of Rupert is the translation, yes, and he acknowledges that some previous translations are more graceful, aesthetically more pleasing, but at times he's departed from that practice to convey the construction, to convey perhaps literally the rhythm of the original. So he's doing something different as a translator. And the notes and the comments at the bottom of the page, they take one's breath away. He is the most erudite and the most learned of all the commentators so far, at least in English, on the Rāmcaritmānas. And not only that, he is a rasik, he is a rasmarmagya. His poetry, his commentary enhances the poetry of Tulsidas, or at least our appreciation of it. I will say one more word. All of us on this panel have known Rupert for a long time. We count him as a friend. And today we are going to discover another editor of this volume, whom I haven't met so far, Neha. We look forward to listening to her with keen anticipation, and of course, to Rupert. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Trivedi. I now request Professor Rupert Snell to introduce and discuss the volume.
Thank you very much, everybody. Most recently, my dear friend Harish, for his exaggerated praise. Thanks to Primus, especially to Bholaji, but also to his entire team for making this book come to be. Amrapali was a wonderful editor. She's not here with us on the panel today, but she's played a really important part in seeing this book through the press. And thanks also to Doctors Jishnu Shankar and Dalpat Rajpurohit and others who have made sample recordings for us, which by and by will become available on the Primus website. So that brings a new aspect to the book. And most of all, my thanks to Neha Tiwari. As I've explained inside the book, she very kindly, just over 2 years ago, offered some help in proofreading. And that help in proofreading turned into editorial help. And gradually that editorial help turned into something much more substantial. And really, this is a book by both of us. She took my draft, which was ready at that stage, and she went through every word and augmented what I had said and brought her fantastic linguistic knowledge and finesse to what I'd written. And so I'm immensely grateful to her. It was a wonderful experience for me to work with such a person over 2 years. Strangely, we've never met except online, but I've worked more closely with her than I have with any other colleague in the past. So thanks to everybody. So this year probably marks the 400th anniversary of Tulsidas's death. My first personal inklings of his greatness came nearly 50 years ago at the 400th anniversary of the writing of the Manas. And I had the very great fortune, although I hardly knew what was going on in all these words that I heard, the great fortune of hearing it recited by Pandit Kapindraji, who came to London for the celebrations about the 400th anniversary and brought the text alive to me. I was still studying modern Hindi as in my BA, but I quickly became really quite passionately involved in studying the earlier literature, although I didn't know at that stage what it would come to mean to me personally and eventually. Time flies, and since that point, I have now been reading Tulsidas, or I should say reading the Rāmcaritmānas, for I think it's, if my maths is correct, 1/9 of the entire lifetime of the text. And to borrow the poet's own reason for writing the Rāmcaritmānas, this book I too wrote Swanta Sukhaya for my own individual delight. It's not been the focus of my work, as it has been so wonderfully, productively for Philip, whose translation is a translation for our times, and whose many, many papers and talks on the book have led us all forward. But it has been for me quite unique in terms of not simply academic, but also personal enrichment. My mind is made to think of Gerard Manley Hopkins' preface to a poem from 1879 on the 17th century composer Henry Purcell. Before the verse begins, he writes this little introduction, which rings true to me in this context. He says, "The poet wishes well to the divine genius of Purcell and praises him that, whereas other musicians have given utterance to the moods of man's mind, he has, beyond that, uttered in notes the very make and species of man, as created both in him and in all men generally." So the Manas is an extremely special text, as Harish has said. I've read a good amount of devotional poetry in Hindi and in translation and in original English, but I know nothing like the Manas. It's a devotional and spiritual classic, of course, but also a profoundly human document. It's a guide, a comfort, and an inspiration. It's also a great poem whose true essence and value can only really be grasped in the original Awadhi, with its music, its compelling flow, its insights and deep human understanding. There's so much to encounter and to appreciate. Hence this attempt to write a book which would be a companion to the poem and would help people forward in appreciating the original. It's not primarily a translation. It's an introduction to those who would like to go beyond translation and use the translation as a route to the original Awadhi. In the Balkand, Tulsi has a long and extremely beautiful and very witty and wise apologia, in which he describes his shortcomings, how he's never going to be able to complete this task that he's set himself, and how one must be wary of any such attempt to encompass this task. And he has a wonderful chopai, which says, Nij kabit ke hiragi nanika, sarasaho atva atifika, je par bhanit sunat harashahi, te bar purush bahut jaganahi. So in the first half chopai, he says, who does not fancy his own poetry, whether sweet or totally bland? And then there's a kind of silent but. And then the second line comes, those fine people who delight to hear the verse of others are rare in the world. So he has started off with a very conventional way of saying that I'm not worthy to do this. And then he completely turns it upside down and throws the responsibility entirely to his audience, who says, well, if you're good people and you listen correctly, you'll find something here. So the rhetoric of the text is far from being conservative. There's so many instances of this where some kind of ironic intervention is there, some kind of sleight of hand in meaning, which is very hard to capture in translation. And I think one of the things that I value about it most is the close harmony between the aesthetic and the spiritual. The sense in which the poetry brings such a special voice that he's able to articulate worldly beauty, for example, and have us read it also as a spiritual beauty. Another aspect of his wit, I'd just like to illustrate with a second example, and this one I'll have to read to make sure I get it correctly. It's again from that apologia in the Balkan, where he's saying that he doesn't have the qualifications to write this poem. And he says, Bhaniti mori sabaguna rahit, visvavidit guna ek, so vichari sunihahi sumati jinke bimal vivek. And then he says, my voice is devoid of all excellences, save one, known throughout the world. Men of pure judgment and good intellect will see this and listen. And then he goes on in switching from Doha to Chopai, and this switch of meters often introduces some kind of rhetorical switch also. He says, and this line always sends a tingle down my spine. Ehimahi Raghupati Nama Udara, Ati Pavan Purana Sruti Sara. And the structure of what he has just done there, switching into Chopai, which has these marching great da rhymes, and to make that fall on the word udara, open, generous, liberal, opens out the meaning in the most brilliant way. So this is why it's one of the many, many reasons which makes this book so special. It's the meanings, the depth, the love is all bound up in the very structure of the words and the verses. And so it's been just a wonderful experience to read it for, over many years, and also finally to write something about it. In this book, it's not a thin book by any means, but there still wasn't space to write everything I wanted to say about its aesthetics. So I'm writing more about that later. But again, I'll close by thanking everybody again. Thanking especially Neha again for being such a fantastic help and co-author. And thanks especially to people who've got up so early in the States to come and listen to us today. Thank you. I shall now mute myself.
Thank you so much, Professor Snell. I now invite Ms. Neha Tiwari to say a few words about the volume.
Thank you, Jyotika. Thank you, Rupert ji, Bhola ji, Harish ji, for all your kind words. I'd like to thank Rupert ji for creating this valuable resource for learners and admirers of classical Hindi poetry and of Manas in particular. I'm deeply grateful to him for carving out a space for me in this massive undertaking and his continued patience and encouragement as I went about my work. I can say that I was the first learner or student who learned how to appreciate the text, Manas. I knew parts of the Manas, but I hadn't read it in so much detail until I started working on this text. I would also like to thank Primus, the entire team for their prompt and professional editorial and publication support. So we've heard a lot about the Manas, so I thought I'd say a few words about reading the Rāmcaritmānas, which we are launching today. It is intended to be a companion or guide for anyone who knows modern Hindi but needs some help in understanding classical Awadhi, in which the Manas is written. The first part of the book covers useful concepts on grammar and prosody that we hope would help make the text more accessible to learners. For instance, when Rupert ji just quoted a verse from the Manas and he said there's a hidden but, it's not there, but you have to read it in the transition between the half lines of the verse. That kind of understanding has been built into the text of either in the prosody section or in the section on grammar, on rhetorical devices. So I think it's a very useful resource for learners of classical Hindi. The last chapter in the first part, called Tulsi's Boatman, demonstrates how all this information on grammar, on rhetoric, on prosody can be used to understand the text in great detail. After that, the second part presents a selection of significant episodes from the Manas and their translations, significant either in terms of either plot development or aesthetics, and some personal bias in such a selection is unavoidable. As Bhola ji and Harish ji said, I think Harish ji in particular pointed out that the translations are accompanied by copious notes wherever we felt there was a need for some extra clarification, either grammatically or in the prosody or in terms of plot. Our hope is that this book will be a useful learning resource for Awadhi in the same way as Rupert ji's Braj Bhasha reader has helped many learners of Braj. And again, my profound thanks to everyone, including friends, family, and colleagues who've contributed in some shape or form in the writing and publication of this book. I'm really, really very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neha ji. I request our first panelist this evening, Professor Philip Lutgendorf, to address the audience today.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we can.
I also want to echo what Harish ji said about Bhola ji's contribution and the beautiful books that Primus has been putting out. They are really so welcome and set such a high standard for publishing, and including, of course, this one. So let me start out by saying that because of the respect that I have for Professor Rupert Snell and his contributions to the study of Hindi and its literature in grammar and language pedagogy, I for years taught with his grammar book, his primer, as well as his beautiful translations of both pre-modern poetry and modern prose, his writings on cultural history and aesthetic criticism. Knowing all of that, you will perhaps understand that I felt a certain nervousness when I learned, when I was myself about 3/4 of the way through with a new translation of the Rāmcaritmānas, that Professor Snell was in the process of writing a book on it that would include many translations from it, as well as a very detailed analysis of its grammar. The book is now come into the light today. It is prakashit, as we say, and it's come into my hands just a month after the publication of my own concluding installment of the Epic of Ram, Volume 7. And I'm very happy, as Rupert ji mentioned, that both of these books come out in this centenary year, this 400th anniversary of Tulsi's Saket Prasthan. And of course, next year, 2024, will be the 450th anniversary of the traditional Manas date of 1574. So we have lots of celebrations, I think, possible. Reading through much, though not yet all, because I only just recently got it, but much of this extraordinary labor of love and scholarship, I have experienced a little bit of relief, feeling that there are not too many things that I would have done a whole lot differently if I had had the benefit of having this book in my hands when I set out on my own Manas Anuvad Yatra more than 13 years ago. But that said, I have already learned a good deal from the book, as I expected I would. And it will hereafter be an essential reference work for any bilingual Manas Premi, as well as for any English medium teacher who seeks to introduce students to the epic and its language. Despite its immense erudition and scholarly detail, it is written in a highly readable style. This is typical of Rupert Ji, that is elegant and often lyrical, but also playful and even mischievous at times. And as Harish Ji has already said, Professor Snell frequently reminds us that Tulsi Baba, who tends to be put on a pedestal today as a poet saint, had a lively and often wry sense of humor. If the book is rhapsodic in its appreciation of Tulsi's poetic genius, this appreciation is based on a painstaking and minute study of the intricacies of his language, syntax, and lexicon. I have delved briefly into these matters in my own writings on the Manas and its performance traditions, but reading this book, the upama that occurs to me is that if I have sometimes examined the epic text with a magnifying glass, this book puts the Manas under an electron microscope, inviting us to think about and marvel at its molecular and even atomic structure. To cite just one example of what I have learned, I was unaware, Rupert Ji, that Tulsi regularly used a special past tense or perfective form of verbs when referring to actions that he wanted to mark as regrettable, rash, or excessive, similar to the usage of baitna as an intensifier in modern Kadiboli Hindi to signal a speaker's disapproval of an action. Ab tum kya kar baitha? Sort of, now what have you gone and done? Snell has dubbed this Awadhi construction, in which the ending isi or esi is added to a verb stem, the aberrant perfective, and also calls it at times the derogatory perfective. And he offers numerous examples of it. Though he notes that its powerfully judgmental inferences appear to be ignored by Manas translators, on reading his examples on page 43, I do think, Sitaram ki kripa se, that I have mostly managed to convey the sense of these verbs correctly in their contexts, even though I did not recognize their distinctive morphology. But now I do, thanks to this book. The bulk of the book, more than 300 pages, consists of 11 selected reading passages from each of the khans of the Manas, accompanied by the author's translations and copious footnotes. The translations are generally fairly literal, and they also adhere fairly closely to the Awadhi text's word order, but they are also often charming and insightful, and both they and the accompanying notes convey a clear sense of the author's sheer delight in savoring the poetry and unpacking its grammatical strategies. I should say grammatical and aesthetic strategies. The passages themselves have obviously been carefully selected, and I'll conclude by commenting on just a few of them. The three selections from Balkand wisely include a key passage from Tulsi's brilliant prologue, in which he holds forth in his own voice, as well as two scenes, the Pulwari and the Dhanush Yagya, that are especially beloved of readers and audiences, particularly at Ram Leelas. Two passages from Ayodhya Kand offer the high drama of Manthara and Kaikeyi's plot and the queen securing her boons from King Dasharatha, as well as Sita's and Lakshman's successful efforts to get Ram's permission to accompany him into exile. 23 very eventful stanzas from Aranyakand include Shurpanaka's mutilation, the annihilation of the army of Karadushan, Maricha's transformation into the magical deer, and Sita's abduction by Ravana. The whole of Kishkinda-Kand and the first 17 stanzas of the beloved and much recited Sundar-Kand are given and analyzed, and so forth, as well as short passages from Lanka and Uttarakhand. If one sometimes misses favorite passages here, such as the long, for me, the long Lakshman Parashuram Samvad in Balkand, and the comparable Angad Ravan Samvad in Lanka Kand, not to mention Kakabusundi, who is one of my favorite characters in the whole Manas, and he's mentioned in the book, but we don't get his life story. But going back to those two samvads, they are two of the most deliciously sarcastic and playful dialogues in the whole epic. Nevertheless, one must recognize that this is already a book of nearly 500 pages. And as Professor Snell wistfully notes on page 411, it is the tragedy of anthologies that they cannot hold the entire text. However, this handbook goes on to hold even more. Two very useful glossaries, one of technical terms drawn from multiple languages and that are used in the English text, and a copious Awadhi glossary that I do wish I had had while working on my own translation. To conclude, I want to express my personal gratitude to Professor Snell and Ms. Tiwari for this matchless contribution to the appreciation and understanding of one of India's and the world's greatest poets. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lutgendorf. I now request Professor John Stratton Hawley to share his observations with everyone.
Well, let me say first that it's an absolutely enormous pleasure to be here with you. I also want to confess that this is, I think, my first engagement with a webinar. So as I surveyed the scene, I thought, oh, what a terrible failure. No one has come. I now see that maybe they have come, but who knows? In any case, there's mystery everywhere. And also, Ola, especially thinking of you, let me say that when I came to India and found that it existed, not just in a hardback, which you had kindly sent me in New York, but also in a paperback, I was just thrilled. There's been quite some comment about the quality of Primus books. To see that quality in a paperback is a special pleasure. And I think especially appropriate somehow to the status of the Manas, Harish, as you were saying, in the history and structure even of the language. I'm going to be focusing on Rupert for reasons that I think will become clear soon, but I'm thinking of you too, Neha, and you'll come in at the end, probably more than you should. But because I have known Rupert longer, this is going to be really about him. I ask you to come with me for a moment. It is not today. It's 4 days ago, last Friday, and I'm in Vrindavan. I just got back from a little trip around town. It started at the Vrindavan Shodh Sansthan, the Vrindavan Research Institute, the VRI. There, as I waited for a man with a glistening face to make a copy of a beautiful set of photos and videos that he had made to document a launch of my own, sort of a launch of my own, we got to talking. We talked especially about the pace of change here and about the fact that his family, which has lived for 500 years in close proximity to the temple of Bihadiji, is about to be displaced, disowned by the corridor that the Modi government is determined to build there. The government's payment for their land will not be enough to enable them to buy replacement land anywhere nearby. The prices are soaring too high for that, thanks to the grand plan of which this corridor is a part. This is vikas. This is development. This moment, and several that followed, made me think back to Rupert, who came from London and specifically from SOAS, where the idea for the Shodhsanstan was hatched, to this very place back in 1977. I know his memories stretch back to the time when Ramdas Gupta founded the VRI in some dusty quarters above the old post office in Loy Bazaar. But who was he then? Who was this young man whose taste for rasa and the nikunj, and above all, perhaps for sangeet, he had learned the sarangi by then, had brought him to this place? From much later days, I know he was able to accept the distance between the focus of his studies, the Chaurasipad of Harivansh at that point, and the insults and shoves of the real world. And yet people have criticized him for including too much of the reality of modern Hindi, modern English, in the book where he claims it's possible to teach yourself this language, a possibility I still doubt. Never mind, it's been a runaway success. What connections would he have been making in his mind as he learned Vrindavan? To his own family and their long English and Welsh history, perhaps, the parampara? I lost my place. To his father's deep and systematic engagement with the actual land of India, perhaps, of England, perhaps, a very different Braj-Kiraj? Or maybe to some verse in the Chaurasipad that especially made him turn to his teacher. This would have been, if so, a literate conversation in very good Hindi, attuned to nuance and sadness and wonder in a way that almost no one else born abroad could manage. Okay, I'll venture it for a moment. No one else, except maybe Philip. The sounds of Vrindavan certainly did not leave him. I remember hearing about a course he gave in Austin that he called My Sweet Lord. I think probably the only time that such a course was listed in the handbook of the University of Texas. My Sweet Lord. Truly, I think that sweetness and also its beetle inflection are deeply a part of who he is. But there's also, as so many of you have stressed, Rupert the technician, Rupert the aesthete in that very different way, explaining Chand, for example, in the early pages of the classical Hindi tradition with all the numbers and accents chasing each other down the page. Why does Chand also mean trickery in Brajvasa? Rupert probably knows. Many years later, we find him translating verses from the Bihari Satsai for the Murti Classical Library of India. I remember how hard he struggled against the then at least carefully laid out Murti, read Sheldon Pollock, canons of translation that the Murti edition expected. One line of the original, one line of translation, the two set opposite one another on facing pages. It wasn't that Rupert wanted free verse or anything like that. God forbid a vertical sprawl down the English side of the page. No. He felt that as a language, English simply required 3 lines to do what Bihari could do in 2. He wasn't asking for freedom, but rather for the freedom to adopt and work out his own discipline. My Sweet Lord is a very demanding Lord in the mouth of Bihari Lal, but you would never know it from what Rupert gives us in response. I hope I have a second just to repeat a couple of these before you. They're short. Number 297. He uses quotation marks here, rather unusual. The very word postponement hits her hard. But what is worse, the sight of mango blossoms drives her mad. Hits her hard, drives her mad. And let me go to one more. This is 386. Again, Radha and Krishna. His body blends with shadows, with shadow. I've misread it, it's terrible. But listen to the words that are missing here, actually, the definite article. His body blends with shadow, hers with moon. 2 souls are one, as Hari and Radha roam the lane. Or look at the fact that he gives us an article on Sudama. Why had no one else in a European language thought to attend to the poignancies of this remarkable figure? I don't know, but I suspect that Rupert may have been intrigued by the fact that Sudama lay on the sidelines of Krishna's battles and loves, or that he and his wife had this awkward monetary problem. Or perhaps it was simply the lure of the mysterious power of friendship itself, which I have known for Rupert for many years, friendship over the long haul. Then there's the matter of Rupert's being interested in actual life. How about Rupert's friend, the 17th century merchant Vanita, about which he has written? That must have brought him into a Rasik-style relationship with Mukund Lat, who loved also the Arthakathanika of Vanita. For Rupert, that whole autobiographical fascination, Atmakatha as it's called in Hindi, developed an industry of its own. Its full results actually still forthcoming. And along the way, we get, for example, a little dialogue with his own body. You're probably afraid of what I'm going to quote, Rupert. With his own body. Let me read a couple lines written in Allahabad in 1973. No bowed instrument is kind to a beginner, but the sarangi offers literal agonies of its own. Playing notes by pressing the cuticle of one's nails against the string yields the sarangi's fluid voice-like sound, but also a pain that brings tears to the eyes, even when the attempted pathos of Bhairavi fails to do so. If you listen to that prose, you wonder if it is actually prose. Isn't it something more at the same time? So don't worry, we're now inching east. One more push and we'll be in Banaras with Tulsidas, and he in turn is turning west toward Awadhi. As Rupert meets this moment in this book, he carries all his earlier craftsmanship with him and his deep interest in learning, in teaching, or probably learning also, the nitty-gritty of Tulsidas's language, teaching that to others. He's interested in Tulsidas as a teacher too. He sets out Tulsi's delight in prefacing the full announcement of his own text in the verses that precede it. And he's interested in trying to look beyond the literary to real life, to autobiography. He says to us, glimpses of the historical living and breathing Tulsidas are sadly all too rare. And he notes how Tulsi's biographers have tended to wash even these away. Philip Lutgendorf, yes, Philip, you, has done a magnificent job of showing us exactly how this happened and in great detail. Somewhat by contrast, what I'm struck by here in Rupert's approach to Tulsi is that he wants to take those glimpses, his word, as not as tropes in their own right, but as poetic shards of biographical reality. Here he's translating Tulsi as Tulsidas speaks of his own remembered self. We'll recognize these verses. Bring Tulsi speaking of a certain him, bringing him into the world. His parents forsook him, nor did fate etch any benefit on his brow. He was wretched, a vessel for scorn and faint-hearted, eager for leaving's throne for dogs. Now, I'm not saying that Rupert Snell is Tulsidas, though it's worth considering the possibility, but I do feel that an exquisite sense of the weight, the effects, the sadnesses, and also the aspirations of one's own autobiographical situation color much of what he does. His wit, we've heard that word a lot, his wit keeps it in check, and he savors Tulsi's wit, but he's also keeping in mind the question of what creates the biographical need for wit. Neha, finally to you. I know that the literary friendship you have brought to Rupert has meant worlds to him. He says so as he writes, and he's told me so personally. But I also know that he too is capable of the most exquisite friendship, even when it goes far beyond the bounds of the literary. He's steadfast, imaginative, he's very knowing. Readers of this book have a chance to sample that friendship in an equally exquisite way, a literary way. And typically, as he befriends Tulsidas from seemingly so far away, he sometimes carries along a little group of other friends, foreign admirers who preceded him on the path. Grau's, Hill, Lutgendorf. I know I'm supposed to end with a set of questions, but what I carry instead is this abiding sense of friendship. literary friendship, a deeply cultivated friendship that jumps centuries and countries. Rupert says the following in a note he gives on page 327 of the Manas book. He says as follows: Bali fairly hurls these words with their inverted repeat and heavy alliteration as he struggles with the ambiguity of his coming death. Here Rupert is befriending a monkey, and in a literary way, another country, another evolutionary century, you might say. How can he stretch this far? Anyone who has lived in Vrindavan knows the force of the question.
Thank you so much, Professor Hawley. I now invite Professor Ruth Vanita to say a few words. Professor Vanita, could you please unmute yourself? We can't hear you.
Sorry. It's a great joy to participate in celebrating this work of marvelous erudition, wearing all that weight of learning lightly like a flower. Congratulations to Rupert and Neha, and congratulations too to Primus on this beautifully produced book. One of the hallmarks of Rupert's scholarship is his ability to express complex ideas in simple language. And this is the mark, I think, of a great teacher. Reading the Rāmcaritmānas explained to me several features of Tulsi's rhetoric and prosody that I had experienced but not understood. This book will also help potential readers to get past being intimidated by the length and canonical status of the Rāmcaritmānas. In a 15th century English play, a character named Knowledge promises to accompany the main character, saying, "Every man I will go with thee and be thy guide in thy most need to go by thy side." This book plays a similar role, and it's rightly termed in its subtitle a companion to the reader of Tulsi's Ramayana. The way that this book helps the reader to a critical appreciation of the Rāmcaritmānas is expressive of another outstanding feature of both Rupert's work and his personality. This feature is modesty, a virtue fast disappearing in our era that unprecedentedly exalts self-esteem and self-love. Modesty, both personal and scholarly, has been prized for millennia in both Indian and Western literary traditions. As Jane Austen puts it, there must be a sort of shyness in the presence of someone whom one respects. In this modesty, Rupert imitates Tulsidas. As Rupert points out, Tulsidas is fully aware of his powers, but Tulsidas is even more aware of his own smallness, and not only in the literary tradition, for example, as an heir to Valmiki, but also in the presence of the cosmos, which is pervaded by Ram, in which Ram is Ramahua. Precisely because it is pervaded by Ram, the cosmos itself is both Tulsidas' subject and his muse. In the opening acknowledgement section, which Harish has quoted, and which Rupert quotes and discusses, Tulsidas bows to all beings, from the gods to the tiniest insect, and even to his enemies and critics. Siya Ramamaya Sab Jagajani, Karau Pranama Jori Jugapani. Like any excellent critical commentary, reading the Rāmcaritmānas is not only witty in itself, but the cause of wit in others. As I went through it, I found it sparking ideas that would never otherwise have come to me. For example, Rupert compares Tulsi's style in his opening with that of the opening of Jayasi's Padmavat. And this led me to notice the similarity as well as the difference between the two poets' ways of approaching the divine. Where Jayasi exalts the divine as an omnipotent ruler who makes, destroys, and changes all creatures as he wishes, Tulsidas sees the divine, Siyaram, in every creature, and thus sees them all, even the demons, not just as creations of, but manifestations of the divine, evolving towards full divinity. A third feature of this work, and I think of Rupert's work in general, is also one that is fast fading away from the academy. This is the ability to express love and admiration of a literary work, rather than considering oneself equal or even superior to the writer and trying to demonstrate the superiority by tearing the work apart. When I was a student, we used to be asked to write a critical appreciation of a poem. And that term critical appreciation, and I think it nicely balances the two dimensions of a scholar's work. Today, however, it's unfashionable to term a poem beautiful or brilliant or visionary or sublime. And to write in such a vein is often to damage or limit one's academic prestige. With admirable daring, Rupert freely uses these words and others such as these. And his love for Tulsidas's poetry, which many have commented on, shines through his writing. Here again, I would say that he, as he himself just now said, he follows Tulsi, who states that he writes for his own joy and satisfaction, Swantaha Sukhaya, and therefore writes about what he loves. In this spirit, Rupert and Neha have chosen to comment on some of the most popular and beloved passages. For example, the episode of the clever boatman, the emblem of devotion, who cooks up a pretext to induce Ram to let him wash his feet and then proceeds to drink the water, which, and of course, drinking the water would be entirely unnecessary if the boatman's only purpose was to prevent his boat being turned into a woman. More than one popular modern bhajan is based on this episode, in which the boatman realizes that he will receive liberation as his wage when he reaches the shore between this life and the next. So it's a popular passage because the popular bhajans have taken it further. As Harish said, they're writing their own Ramayana. Encouraged by this book to return to the text, I made what for me were interesting discoveries about the continuing living presence of Tulsi. For instance, its relevance in the context of the recent return of Allahabad to the name it had borne since at least the time of the Mahabharata, where it is mentioned as Prayag, and that it continued to bear for Hindi speakers and writers right up to the mid-20th century. Mahadevi Varma, one of the city's most illustrious residents and a staunch Gandhian, invariably calls the city Prayag in her writings. When the name returned, I had thought that Prayag would be a better name than the unfamiliar Prayag Raj. I discussed this with Harish. It was only on returning to the Rāmcaritmānas, spurred by Rupert and Neha, that I realized that the name Prayag Raj may perhaps originate in the Rāmcaritmānas. Ko kahi sakai Prayaga prabhau, kalusha punja kunjara migarau, asatiratapati dekhi suhava, sukh sagar raghupati bhar sukh upava, kahi siya lakhanahi sakhahi sunai, Srimukh Tiratha Raja Badai. Who can tell the greatness of Prayag, the lion which destroys the elephants of Papua? Viewing the Lord, the Raj of all pilgrimage fords, Ram, the ocean of joy, felt joy and praised Tirath Raja, the king of pilgrimage places, to Lakshman and Sita. Tulsi began writing Rāmcaritmānas in 1574, and Prayag was officially renamed Allahabad in 1575. Although, as I said, among most Hindi speakers and writers, it remained Prayag. Thus, Rupert and Neha's book points to the evergreen quality of the Rāmcaritmānas, from its engagement with material reality, such as the monkey's enjoyment of life that Jack referred to, all the way to its immersion in eternal things, such as the joy and strength conferred by devotion and by the music of the text. Let me end by quoting Rupert on Tulsi's artistry. I quote, "The rhythms have a cumulatively hypnotic effect, almost independently of meaning. The sounds of Tulsi's language supply a deeply rewarding sense of cohesion, unity, and aesthetic satisfaction. The Manas forges a link between a divine transcendent narrative and the commonality of experience for all who value it as a guide." Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Vanita. Before we move towards summing up today's events, I just want to let everyone know we'll have a Q&A session after the panel discussion. So in case anybody has any questions for the panelists or the authors, please leave it in the Q&A box below and we'll direct it towards the author and the panelists. But before that, I request Professor Trivedi to take the floor to kind of sum up and reflect on everything that's been discussed in tonight's event.
Yep, my unmute has finally worked. Yep. No, I'm not going to sum up. I'm only going to pay tribute to all the speakers by highlighting some of the most wonderful things that they said. How can one sum them up? No, that's not. So I'll just pick out one or two things that each one of you have said. and underline them and highlight them again. I think that's the best way to go about it. I will not do that to Rupert. Rupert is the host. But I liked Udara. I liked your enactment of Udara, bodily enactment of Udara. That was, it went to show, I mean, your body language at its most eloquent. It went to show how deeply engaged you are, not only at an intellectual and emotional level, but at a physical level, with what you have been talking about in this book. Is great to see. It's wonderful to, yep. What you said about it being a fulfilling thing for you, fulfilling work for you, that I think is very touching. A number of people have found fulfillment of one kind or another through devoting themselves to a study or at least a reading of the Rāmcaritmānas over the years. The modes of that fulfillment have been evolving and changing. This is, I think, a poetic and a rasic fulfillment, more than, of course, a devotional fulfillment. And I don't know what you were getting at, though, when you said Nijikabitte ke hilagan nika. They were on dangerous ground there. Are you prompting us to appreciate your work in the way that Tulsidas wanted people to halshao at other people's vanity? Yeah, we take the hint. We do that. We do that already. Yeah. That was wonderful. Philip, I liked your rephrasing Rupert's statement about this being the anniversary of Tulsidas's death to his Saket Prasthan. How wonderful. I mean, who among even Hindi users would say that? Saket Prasthan. That was wonderful. I share your feeling about Parashuram and Angad, those two passages. I mean, ever since childhood, when I was a child, we used to enact in little rooms with minimal makeup, the Parashuram Lakshmana Sambad. No? Rousing passage. Yeah. So I share that. But at the same time, what Rupert has done here, Rupert has gone in for, is that it's not only in those set pieces that Tulsi's humor lives and his wit, but that it pervades the whole work. That is new. That kind of insight that it is almost subterranean and runs right through. I do not know Hindi grammar, being a native speaker, but I must take issue with one thing, which you pointed out, Philip, in relation to what Rupert is saying about the use of that tense whose name I have already forgotten. Ye tu kya kar baitha? Being derogatory and judgmental, as you put it. No, not always. Not in my case. Because I can quote something. It's not, it should be in the Rāmcaritmānas, but it's not. It's just outside Rāmcaritmānas, in which kar baitha is used in a very positive sense. Please listen attentively, both of you. नाना करते प्यार तुम्ही से कर बैठे, नाना करते प्यार तुम्ही से कर बैठे, करना था इनकार मगर इकरार तुम्ही से कर बैठे. Nothing derogatory about that, nothing judgmental about that. It's a joy, it's a delight. About Jack, what I would say is, Jack, your piece was as if written not in Awadhi but Braj. There was a madhurya to your statement, which, all right, we'll give it to you, which is only to be found in Braj. And also, I thought you came dangerously when you said the two things you said. One, you talked about his past, not only regarding Bihari, but also Banarsi Das, which may be a future yet. There may be more to come there, but also about your own intimate friendship with him in a way that at places got very tantalizing, and about what you know about him and which you are not telling but hinting at. And I thought that was playing with fire. And also, I enjoyed very much, you're suggesting that you are not suggesting that Rupert is Tulsidas. This was picked up by Ruth as well, when she talked about, things that were similar between Tulsi and it is a certain osmotic quality about work done over a long period. There certainly is. And especially if you do it, as Ruth said, not critically, but appreciatively. In critical appreciation, certainly it's the appreciation that dominates in the case of Ruth, in the case of Rupert, rather than critical. That's a very well made point. Modesty, Rupert's modesty is, what I like about, modesty is very hard to take. Most people's modesty is not modesty. It is nicely put on, it's very fetching, but it's not the real thing. Unpretentious modesty like Rupert's, modesty which doesn't say it's modest, but shows itself to be modest, that is very rare, and certainly Rupert has it. So that was again very well pointed out. About Prayag and Prayagraj, I come from Prayag, and therefore I have a big stake in the matter. I totally agree with Ruth. There are only, I don't know, generation what, who think that Allahabad was removed and Prayag was put in as an invented name, or Prayagraj. They know nothing about India. They know nothing about our culture. The short life of Allahabad is the name of the place. From 1575, as Ruth said, in my own recollection, is more like 1580 or 82, when Akbar actually comes to Allahabad and builds a fort there at the Sangam. What a thing to do, to build a fort at the Sangam. But that's what they were doing, and he renames it. So yes, but about one small point, Prayagraj originating in Tulsidas, I remember a bit of a Sanskrit shlok, which probably goes further back. Satirtha Rajo Jayatu Prayagaha. May Prayag, the king of all Tirthas, achieve Jay, have Jay, may go on conquering. Satirtha Rajo Jayatu Prayagaha. And the Raj that is appended to it comes from that. It's also Prayagraj because there are not one Prayag, there are 5 Prayagas. Karna Prayag, Dev Prayag, and so on. So therefore, of all those 5 Prayags, it is the Raja. That's why Prayagraj. You can see I'm a sworn Allahabadi, even though I'm praising Prayag. One doesn't have to reject one to embrace the other and to know about the other, to acknowledge the other. About Jayasri that you mentioned, I found out something only today. Today I read an account on a web magazine in Hindi of a poem by Jayasri on Krishna, a long epic poem, which was first published in Hindi in 1985. And somebody, Madhav Hada, who has written a book on Meera earlier, he wrote a little article introducing us to it. And it's such a beautiful story about Rama in it that I must narrate it. When Kans was getting very tyrannical, Narad went to Vishnu Bhagavan and said, Lord, it is high time that you incarnated yourself again on earth, because only you can contain and kill Kansa, no human being can do it. And hence, of course, the Krishna avatar. His avatar is Krishna. But in the beginning, Vishnu is most reluctant in this version, Jayasi's version. Vishnu says, no, no. In my last avatar, as Rama, I had such a hard life on earth. I had to go through so much sorrow and so many hardships that I'm not coming down to earth again. That's what he says. I mean, what could be more human than the Supreme God Vishnu in saying this? But I think he made up for it in Vrindavan, Hawley, Jack Hawley, by having all that fun time when he came down finally, which Rama was denied. All the gopis, 16,000 or however many. So he made up for that. I will also in the end repeat and sum up one thing which Jack was talking about. There is not only Braj Bhasha reader done by Rupert, there is also, of course, the supreme translation of Braj Bhasha Dohas, Bihari Satsai, a very large, substantial selection from it. And now there is Rāmcaritmānas. And before both of these, there was the Atmakatha, a volume full of selections from Bachchan's, Harivansh Rai Bachchan's Atmakatha. So he seems to be the only one I know who has translated into English substantial works in all the three forms of Hindi. Brajabhasha, Awadhi, which ran concurrently, and Khadipoli. This is a tremendous achievement. I mean, he is in cricketing terms an all-rounder and a half. What can't he do in terms of his knowledge of Hindi and virtuoso translation from Hindi? I will end with the last doha of Rāmcaritmānas, on which Rupert has offered extremely delightful, sophisticated commentary at the end of his work, this book. Kami hinari piyari jimi lobhi he priya jimi dam, timi raghunath nirantara priya lagahu mahiram. That's the last doha. After that, there are two Sanskrit shlokas, but they don't matter. There's the last bit of Awadhi, and what Rupert points out is that Tulsi so contrives the doha that the last word of his great work will be Ram. That's the rhyme. And then people have alleged that he is like Tulsi. He surely aspires to be. Because in his own commentary, he so contrives, Rupert, that in the English commentary, the last word is Ram. He is echoing that trick, is replicating that trick fabulously well. But that doha is a very odd doha. For a very, very long time, 50 years almost, I've struggled with it. At the end of Rāmcaritmānas, saying that he is totally devoted to Ram, what is Tulsi saying? That he is as devoted to Ram as a lustful man is devoted to a beautiful woman, to any woman, and as a person, lobhi priya jimidam, a greedy person is devoted to money and to wealth. Similarly, Tulsi says, be dear to me, O Ram. Is this the limit? Are these appropriate, apt similes? No, no, they are not. They bring the level down. That's what I've always felt. Surely Tulsi's devotion is much greater and of a different in a different category, of a different order. But finally, I've cracked it. And this moment, I'm about to divulge my own new interpretation of it, which all of you can later on incorporate into your works with or without acknowledgement. Which is, what is Tulsi doing? What is Tulsi is doing is reminding us that there are several purusharthas. There is Kama, there is earth, and there is moksha through dharma, which is for him. which is the second line. But the first two Purusharthas have traditionally been put on the same level, the four Purusharthas. It's a progression. So from Kama and Artha, you evolve to a being which then will, through dharma, attain moksha. That's the process being described by Tulsi in his culminatory doha. Kami hinari piyari jimi, lobhi hai priya jimi dam, timi raghunath nirantara, priya lagahu mohira. Ram will be dearer to a number of people who cannot read Awadhi because of the efforts of my dear friend Rupert, Snell and Neha, and before that, of course, Philip and a number of others like Grouse and other translators. What a wealth we have of Tulsi in English, this being the latest, but certainly not the least, from Rupert and Neha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Trivedi. We have time for a few questions now. So let me just read some out. The first question, I think, I hope Professor Snell and Neha ji can give their opinions on this. So the first question is, as Tulsidas takes liberties on defining his own Ram, what is his understanding of the historicity of the person Ram, which must have had a singular objective story rather than many literary variations and lenses? Professor Snell, you're on mute. Could you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that question had an interesting effect. It made Harish immediately leave the room. So I maybe I'll take that strategy also. I think I don't know what Neha will say about this, but I feel that there is a way in which the question is almost unanswerable and also almost unaskable, because I believe that the way that the Ramayana narrative is told by Tulsidas leaves itself open to every different level of interpretation, from the literal to the completely abstract and sublime. Somewhere along that line, we would find Tulsi's own position. But in my view, the effect of a text of this kind, which can be read by some people as historical or quasi-historical, and others as abstract, and others as harnessing literary quality to achieve some level of spiritual understanding, the question of literalness or not literalness evaporates for me. I don't give it any value. Neha?
No, I echo your sentiment, and I feel that it's a difficult question to answer, because when I read the Manas and when I look at the portrayal of Ram in the Manas, it's not a person and it's not just one story. He's just pervading the entire text and the entire universe, and we reflect on the world through the story of Ram and what happens in our own lives through what happens in Ram's life. So it's yes, there is a story, and yes, there are moments where you can say that this is what Tulsidas does differently compared to what Valmiki has done in his own Ramayana, and this is where the two differ. But I don't think that is Tulsi's point, really. The point is to bring out the spiritual dimension of the story in a way that it doesn't fully come through in Valmiki's version. So
our second question is for Professor Trivedi. This question is, when we talk about the Ramayana in different South Asian languages, we usually talk about retellings. However, as you pointed out, in English, we have a long tradition of translations of the Ramayana. And so how does one distinguish between retellings and translations of the Ramayana? Professor Trivedi, you're still on mute. Yes, we can hear you.
I was saying that's a very fine question. And I'll give you a short answer and then a slightly less short answer. The short answer is, if it is into English, it's a translation. If it's into an Indian language, then it's a retelling. But beyond that, I mean, it's not only a joke. There's a serious point there. In the Indian languages, we own the Ramayana. We feel that we can do with it whatever we like. And we have done it, substantially altering it throughout history. There's so many Ramayanas and there's so many Mahabharatas which retain the superstructure of the epics, but then the infrastructure is extremely local, belonging to Odisha, belonging to the Hindi area, belonging to the Kannadiga area, belonging to the Malayalam area, and so on. That is why it's such a fascinating process to compare the Valmiki Ramayana with all of these versions, a work that has fascinated so many scholars. Indira Goswami, for example, the Gyanpith Award-winning novelist from Assam, she has done a very fine bit of work on it. About 10 scholars have written wonderful books collating, not comparing so much as collating the different Ramayanas in different languages. Also, by translating it into English, nobody becomes the Adi Kavi in English. What I find absolutely fascinating is that regardless of chronology, if you retell the Ramayana into a language, modern Indian language, so-called vernacular once upon a time, then you become one of the greatest poets automatically almost, just by rendering that theme. And in many of these languages, you become Adi Kavi, the first poet, just as Valmiki was the Adi Kavi. I was so fascinated to find that in Nepali, the Ramayana was rendered only in the 19th century. But the poet who rendered this is called the Adi Kavi in Nepali in the 19th century. It's fascinating to watch this process. I could answer it better, but maybe some other time. And that's enough of an answer for the moment. Thank you.
The next question is for Professor Snell. What editions or versions of the Manas have you looked at for your work? Have you had a chance to look at the manuscripts?
Second question first. No, I haven't. I've gone by the most popular edition of the Manas, the Gita Press edition, which I know Philip has also used in his translation, and I think is primarily the basic, the text that pretty much everyone uses these days. I mean, that is not to say that there aren't questions about editions and about manuscripts and about the life of the text, if I can say in that term, in those terms of manuscript transmission and so forth. But as I've discovered in my other work, if you go down that path and insist on critical edition, you'd need many lives, I guess, to simply achieve a formally edited text. And for my money, those lives are better spent elsewhere. I think we have a received text which is pretty good. It's not the same as, I mean, there are variations available in the different editions. I've used primarily Gita Press. I've also used Philip, you may have to help me out here, the one from Benares, what's it called?
Kashiraj.
Sorry?
Sorry.
Kashiraj edition. Yes, Kashiraj edition.
Vishwanath Prasad Mishra.
That's it. Right. Thank you. And I used that for one particular aspect that uses particular characters to show certain, use particular vowel signs to indicate certain things in the text. And I found that very interesting and very useful. And also I just, if the text puzzled me in some way, then I would check in that edition to see what the reading was there. It's an interesting question, and sure, as in every text of that period, there is work to be done on editorial history.
Our next question is for Professor Snell and for Neha ji. Tulsidas refers to Ramchandra as Garib Nawaz in the Manas. In South Asia now, this epithet is mostly used for Muinuddin Chishti of Ajmer. So I would appreciate any insights on why Tulsidas chose this epithet, and what does this choice say about his lexicon, his cultural grammar? Where did he get this from?
Another really interesting question, and I'm not a specialist on this at all. But sure, one can pick up references, intertextual references of that kind. But what is much harder is to say with any certainty what the history of a particular phrase or compound, as it were, may be, because all of the poets writing at that particular, or at any period, are tapping into a shared common lexicon of terminology. As far as I can see, there's no way of retracing that history with any accuracy. But it's very clear from Tulsi that he was not. I mean, the Manas has quite a large number of loan words from Persian Arabic, Perso-Arabic, as one might say. They are by no means regarded as being other from part of the Awadhi, perhaps part of the spoken Awadhi that he was familiar with. So I think it comes from the floating tradition rather than necessarily from any other particular text. But that's just my hunch. Neha?
I agree with you. I also don't know the origin, like how did this phrase come up in Manas and what the source might be, but I think I agree with Professor Snell's hunch. Yeah.
May I add something to it?
Yes, of course. That question was actually for all the panelists. So if you or Professor Lutgendorf, Professor Hawley, Professor Vanita have anything to add, please, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Philip and I have talked about it, especially at the JLF launch, where I said something touching on it and it caused a controversy. And Ashok Vajpayee had to use his diplomatic offices. but before that, let me quote a line from Tulsidas, which is not in Rāmcaritmānas. It's from Kavitavali. Ram garib nevaj pane ho, garib nevaje, garib nevaju. What a line! Ram is called Garib Nevaj, Nevaj, not za as in Persian, ja as in Awadhi, and also ga, localized. Ram, you have become Garib Nevaj and Garib Nevaj and Garib Nevaj of Garib Nevaj. Ram Garib Nevaj bane ho, Garib Nevaj, Garib Nevaj. What a stunner of a line. Now, it is entirely to Tulsi's credit that he picks up an Arabic Persian word and applies it to Ram, which now or at other times also could be called blasphemy. What is Tulsi doing? Tulsi is being an integrationist. Tulsi is being as udara in his attitude as anyone could be in his times or even later times, even in present times. Garib Nawaz is not Chishti's title. It is the protector of the poor who's kind to them. And as Rupert said, there are many such words in the Rāmcaritmānas. The Belgian scholar, Polish scholar, Danuta Stasik has made a list of all the words, Arabic Persian words in the Rāmcaritmānas, and I'm sure there are many concordances of Rāmcaritmānas which also reflect that. There are about 100 such words, at least, verifiable. One of the words I love is Bagh. Tulsi is very fond of Bagh. He does not say Upavan. He does not say one. He has Aranya, of course, But Bag for him is fascinating. And he slips it into a Sanskrit terminology. Koop Tarag, Bag Tarag, Koop, etc. The surrounding words are all Sanskrit. Another is Ruk. Ruk meaning inclination. Kaikeyi wants to ask Dasharath for those long-standing boons. But first she goes and sees what Dasharath's Ruk is, what his mood is, how he is inclined towards granting them. Very subtle use of Arabic and Persian.
Can I throw in one more? He's very fond of Sahib.
Sahib.
And he'll Sanskritize it as Su-Sahib. Right?
Yep.
And even in I believe the very first instance of Garib Niwaj in the Manas is Gai Bahor Garib Niwaju Sarala Sabala Sahib Raguraju. You get Sahib in the same chopai. Yeah. But interesting, much more Perso-Arabic in Tulsidas than in Jayasi.
Yeah.
Jayasi really tries to stick to a Tadbhav and Tatsam vocabulary.
Is the anxiety of identity.
Rupertji was.
I want to, for a second, to stand on Philip's very tall shoulders and make another point about this Tadbhav business. That it was very interesting to me, or to us, as we were working on the book, and thanks to the indexes that one has access to these days, and also for easy word searches through various means, that Tulsi uses two different Tadbhava expressions for Lakshman. He says Lakhan and he says Lachiman, but they're not used consistently throughout. I forget the detail of it now, but one of them, I think it's Lakhan, is used in the first two khandas only and then never reappears. So there's all sorts of things to wonder about the composition of the text when you get into this really close examination of which words are used when, to separate out the different khandas as being, what would explain that? What would explain that? Is it just a metrical thing? No, it can't be, because then there would be a distribution throughout the text. So, there are many, many more questions about the lexicon of the Manas than there are answers at the moment. Sorry, that's a really boring point.
Our next question is for Professor Snell. What is your view about Sita's fire ordeal, as in Valmiki and Tulsidas? Tulsi has the episode of Chaya Sita, which is not there in Valmiki.
Oh, Neha, this is for you.
Nehaji, please, we'd love to hear what you think.
No. We must first hear from Rupertji, then I'll.
No, I don't know. People have written books about this. How do we get into it? People have written books about this. We had a quite brilliant PhD student at UT Austin in Texas, whose PhD was on precisely this point. I really think it's too big a question to attempt to answer, which is to say, I don't know what to think. Have you got any easy questions?
I guess that just goes to see how you define easy. Nehaji, first, now that Rupertji has answered, would you like to weigh in?
Like Rupertji said, it's a question that requires a detailed study, and I'm just I'll just say how I would maybe rationalize it from my perspective, and it may be entirely wrong, but just because there is a question there, one can attempt an answer. I think Tulsi, like I said earlier, goes a step beyond Valmiki's Ramayana in bringing out the spiritual dimension of Ram's story. And the Chaya Sita episode is another example of that, where in Valmiki we may be left questioning how could that happen? And, we feel for Sita and the injustice done to her. In the Chaya Sita episode, that kind of the whole thing becomes less severe. The injustice is not there. It's like a Leela almost. It's not really that she had to go through a fire ordeal. It was made to appear like she went through a fire ordeal, and reducing that level of injustice and severity kind of enhances it brings out this, I guess, it makes the spiritual kind of universe of Manas more cohesive compared to Valmiki in some sense. But that's just my hunch. I would have to read more on this and think about it more.
Okay, I think we can take one last question. Oh, sorry, Professor.
Sorry, just want to say one other thing that occurs to me. You know, there's a broader question that is often asked about Ram's so-called mistreatment of Sita and the comments that are made about womanhood and so forth in the text. And these are difficult questions to answer and very controversial. But when I'm asked that question, I know I'm sort of writing my own questions now because I've got slick answers for them, but anyway, you have to put up with that. You know, why was Tulsi really misogynistic in his attitudes? That is a question that I have heard come up many, many times, and people writing original poetry on that very theme. But I have a sort of counter question for that, which is that, tell me the name of a single 16th century poet in any language, in any corner of the world, who thinks like a 21st century person. Because I would be interested to read that. Times change, ideas evolve. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we can take one last question, which is for Professor Snell and Neha ji again. And you can let me know if this one is easier than the last.
Yes.
How does one negotiate with the constantly changing musicality and the category of the performative in the Manas?
Well, those are two questions, not one, so it's inherently difficult.
It was phrased as one question, so I thought I'd give it as one.
All right. I think the answer to the first is that it's impossible to, you can't analyze music in ways which reproduce the same effect as the music itself. You can describe it. And that goes to the heart of the matter, as why this book was worthwhile writing, because given the fact that you can't explain or analyze the musical character of the language, all you can do is try to lead people to the original language itself, which is the whole purpose of this book. Sorry, what was the second question?
The second part was, how does one negotiate with the category of the performative in the Manas?
By reading Philip's book. I mean, Philip has done this completely wonderful, I don't know, is it an ethnography? Not an ethnography. It's just a wonderful, broadly based, but very focused study on performance aspects of the text. It's not something that we tried to do even remotely. So it's a wholly different approach and question to the one that we have taken. And I think Philip's book really is the only book that I know about any Indian tradition which answers that question so definitively. However, having said that, I also think that by concentrating exclusively on external performative aspects of the text, it's easy to downplay too far what I call the kind of the stage of the mind in which one performs the text internally. I recently read a paper by a colleague in the States who said that who was making a point, as I understood it, by saying that alliteration in poetry, a poetry which is very heavily alliterative, is by definition performance poetry. And I found that very hard to accept, because when you read something silently to yourself, my heavens, you feel and hear the alliteration. You don't have to have a voice speaking it to you. Poetry is poetry. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for taking all these questions. So we can wrap up now. So I would request Dr. Prasoon Chatterjee to give the vote of thanks to end this wonderful evening tonight.
It has been such a wonderful evening that one doesn't want to put an end to this, but I'll have to do this for matters of practicality. So here goes. From Primus Books, I would first like to thank the audience who have listened to an evening of wonderful discussion with rapt attention. We hope you like reading the book as much after these observations by the professors of literature, religion, gender and cultural studies who were on the panel today. This is the appropriate stage and occasion to thank Mr. Shugat Jain, the managing director of Primus and Ratnasagar Books, who follows and supports his father, Dr. Dhanesh Jain's vision, and whose constant support and encouragement, even during these trying times of the pandemic, has helped us keep the publishing quality, quality research and bringing them to the readers. While we gradually emerge from the shadows of these times, this support and commitment towards academic publishing will be remembered. I would like to thank our chair for the occasion, Professor Harish Trivedi, for releasing the book or launching the book and moderating the discussion, and our eminent panelists, Professor Philip Lutgendorf, Professor Jack Hawley, and Professor Ruth Vanita for their extremely relevant observations about the book. We express our gratitude to them for taking out some of their valuable time to be here today and present us with their views about reading the Rāmcaritmānas. We would like to thank Professor Rupert Snell and Ms. Neha Tiwari for believing in Primus Books and giving us the opportunity to publish this wonderful work of research. Our thanks are due to all who were a part of publishing this work. We are grateful to Mr. B.N. Verma, head and founder of Primus Books, for being here with us today to address the gathering. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you. Okay, namaste, bye.
Namaste. Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you for being here.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Philip and Harish, they offer stats. And a happy Holi to all of you.
Thank you.
तुम पीछे पड़े हो.
हाँ, खास तौर से आपके पीछे.
अच्छा, ठीक है. मिलते हैं.
और फिलिप, आपसे भी मेरे को किताब निकलवानी है. I see a book. बाकी सब ने तो जैक ने हमारे साथ पब्लिश किया, रूपर्ट और नेहा जी ने, और अब ये रूथ हमारे साथ जुड़ी हुई हैं. आप भी एक बार ट्राई करके देख लीजिए.
How about how about a new edition of Life of a Text, which has been out of print in India since 1993.
आप उसके इंट्रोडक्शन वो रिवाइज करके उसमें कुछ ऐड करके करिए. और मैं बिफोर एवरीवन पैक्स ऑफ, can I say something which is very interesting, in the usage of language. And this happened to, this is a real life incident. I was then working in Manohar Books, and I walked into my office and I see our man Friday, with his head bowed down